It's interesting too. You talk about JFK, and I admit I knew a little bit, in terms of our presidents. Teddy Roosevelt being a big physical culture guy. I think he's sort of the famous one. I actually had no idea that JFK had really emphasized that as a key point.
JFK is fascinating in his own right. He didn't call himself a historian. I just read Profiles in Courage for the first time last week. I've heard about it for years, but I found it used at a bookstore in Ojai. I was up there hiking last weekend, and the library had a book sale. Of course, I've got to go over there and look around. It's like a hardback cover of JFK 1955 for $3. So I read it, and at the beginning of the book, he says, "I'm not a historian," but he was very historically trained. I mean, he worked with a number of real historians that were classically trained to help him edit the book and make sure that it was accurate. But when he wrote about physical fitness, he really put it all together. He knew the connection to ancient Greece. He knew the connection sound mind, sound body. He got the whole picture. The movement quality was all there. He came out of that World War II generation. And yes, he had a horrible back injury from the war and other physical things going on, but he was undergoing back treatment with Dr. Hans Kraus, who was part of the story because it was the Kraus-Weber test for key postural fitness that was presented to President Eisenhower in the early 1950s, and Bonnie Pruden was Kraus's research assistant. Bonnie Pruden is just like one of the greatest physical educators ever in American history. And basically it exposed that post-World War II, American youth were extremely weak compared to European counterparts and even children in South America.
Wow.
And because Eisenhower was a military man, he understood the importance to national security, and it was out of that Kraus-Weber test. They tested tens of thousands of people all over the world, basically, children, that this fervor developed, and then you saw, unfortunately, the mistake was made again to emphasize sports, and there was this massive explosion of sports stadiums coming out of the 50s, like massive, venues built, and this big push for sports. But really what we needed then and need now is not a sport emphasis. We need a physical education emphasis. And this is something that's frustrating. As a history person, you tend to know what works and what doesn't if you study long enough. And there's an emphasis today, because we have so many problems with PE, there's some people lobbying now to push sports again, and it's the wrong thing to do. Sports is part of PE, but it should never be PE. PE shouldn't be sports central.
It's interesting that whenever, from my own reading of history, whenever you have this spike in sports popularity, you have a lot of people criticizing it, writing about it as sort of this decadence and this emphasis on spectators.
Yeah.
It becomes sort of more about the spectator event than actually training the youth. I've seen that in a little bit of the 18th century, and then Teddy Roosevelt, obviously, we talked about that. He wrote a little bit about that in his time, and that's interesting.
Well, J.B. Nash wrote the book in 1932 called Spectatoritis, and it was a national conversation. It's part of my research in leisure, which is, to me, the most important thing I should be talking about. Is the classical idea of leisure in ancient Greece, which is when you're not eating, sleeping, and going to school or work. You're spending your free time doing what? In the classical sense, you should be learning and elevating culture, and not just spending it in passive amusement. What would that be like? Well, if you're just playing video games over and over, that's passive amusement. If you're just watching mindless stuff on YouTube or TikTok, or there are ways to watch things that can be uplifting or educational or learning. And I know that might sound like really drab and boring to people, but if you look back at history, that is what determines a nation's success or failure, is how they spend their leisure time. And so, as a history person, I can just look at how most Americans spend their free time and know we're in real trouble. And this is where classical PE help people learn how to spend their leisure time more wisely by doing outdoor activities and physical activities.